midday devotional. Today is Tuesday, July 21st, and as I mentioned on yesterday, it is extremely hot outside. And I want to encourage everyone to please take the necessary precautions to remain safe. Make sure if you're outside that you drink plenty of fluids in order to remain hydrated. This week, we're actually discussing the topic matters that really matter. On yesterday, we spent time discussing domestic violence, and that is truly a matter that matters. Today, we're going to somewhat continue, but narrow that down to marital abuse. Uh, I want to make sure that throughout this COVID 19 pandemic, we do these lessons every day at noon, but I want them to be bigger than just a Bible lesson. I want it to be clinical. I want it to address uh, things that impact day to day lives. And what I'm discovering, especially during this restricted movement time, is that domestic violence is on the upswing. Marital abuse is also on the upswing. Just this week in Prince George's County, there have been a number of reported murders. Crimes of passion are escalating. And it's simply pointing up that as local residents, even of the DC metropolitan area, we're not immune to these matters. So today, let's talk about marital abuse. Let me define it. Abuse involves two major approaches, which are verbal and physical. Now, everything else that happens related to abuse are in some manner derivatives of verbal and abuse. When we talk about, that the abuse wheel, when you talk about intimidation, humiliation, financial abuse, uh, threats of taking privileges away, whether it's sexual privileges or taking children away or property, uh, those things are driven by verbal abuse and physical abuse. Now, when we look at a contrast of time from 1960 up to 2009, uh, family dynamics have changed. In 1960, 91% of homes where children abode, 91% of those homes were two parent homes. By 2009, only 73% of homes where children dwelled were two parent homes. What does that mean? Well, the dynamics of the family is changing. You have more live-in situations. You have more, honestly, just single parent situations to where uh, there may be no children involved. You just have two adults, and where there is no real commitment, where there is no license to keep them together. Sometimes people marry for funny reasons, uh, financial reasons. You've heard the term gold diggers. Well, gold diggers come in two genders, male or female. Normally, we just hear about, oh, she's a gold digger. Well, a gold digger might be a male. And regardless of whether it's a male or a female, it is still a form of abuse because you're taking advantage of someone. Now, traits of marital abuse, are not as easy to identify as you may think. Here's why. I'm going to give you 5 things that sometimes disguises the abuse that might be going on behind closed doors. It's not unheard of for an abuser to be charismatic and very charming. For some unknown reason, they are oftentimes more physically attractive and appear to be polite in public. Uh, it's not unusual for them to be extremely jealous. But again, it's not easy for just the general population to readily identify them. Here's why. Oftentimes, they are driven by an inward hate that the spouse is getting attention that in their mind should always be directed toward them, the abuser. So, extreme jealousy. So, they may be smiling publicly, but inside, that hate is really building up. Uh, Control. Uh, there's typically an attempt to control the other person wherever you find abuse taking place. Uh, they must at all times be dominant over the spouse, regardless of how small the matter might be. Uh, Here's what it sometimes looked like in marital abuse. The individual will get so upset about the most trivial of matters. A person could have a utensil, an eating utensil in their hand, and if it is not positioned, excuse me, let me drink a swallow of water here. If it is not positioned the way the other person want it to be positioned, when dinner is over, that one little incident could lead itself to a big blow up, an insulting verbal, and oftentimes a physical assault against the spouse. Because in the other person's mind, you humiliated me. And the other person is saying, how did I humiliate you? It was the way you held your utensil. That was embarrassing. Here's another way. Deception. Marital abuse often is filled with deceptive tactics, almost without exception. Marital abusers are imposters. They're fake. They are loveless individuals. They pretend to be loving, but rarely are they capable of loving. Something has gone wrong inside of them, and they pretend to love, but they can't really love. Erich Fromm, in an old book that's out of publication now, wrote a book entitled The Art of Loving. What Erich Fromm pointed up in that old book is that true unconditional positive regard love, we call it agape love, must be learned. And if a person doesn't learn to love, they don't just walk down the street and pick up the habit of loving. Typically with abusers, they haven't learned the art of loving. It's not unusual for marital abusers to be arrogant in their spirit. Now, these marital abusers are haughty. They're lifted up with a false pride regarding themselves. And these marital abusers will never take responsibility for their slanderous attacks, their relentless ridicule of the other spouse, any words, any actions, or appearances of remorse, don't believe the hype. Typically, they are not to be trusted because it's only a matter of time before they recoil on you like a snake and they're going to repeat those abusive behaviors all over again. So the I'm sorry is normally added to a but, or I'm sorry, and you know you're really the reason why I did what I did. I'm sorry, but if you hadn't have done this or if you hadn't have said this, I wouldn't have hit you. Most of the time, the apologies, the I'm going to make it right, is just really not to be trusted in a marital abuser's relationship. Now, what do we attribute, or what are some of the attributes of the abuser? Well, they don't mind humiliating you. They don't mind verbally abusing. They don't mind threatening to do physical harm. But here's another big attribute. Typically, they have a family history of marital abuse. Now, without exception, they have a poor self-image of themselves. But remember when I talked about their arrogancy? You'll never know they have a poor self-image of self because it is masked through their arrogant demeanor, their condescending demeanor, their know-it-all demeanor. But typically within, they have a very poor self-image of themselves. Here's a big attribute. They blame the other spouse for their outbursts, for their violence, for their cursing, and that's what I was saying earlier. Every inappropriateness by the abuser is somebody else's fault. They made me do this. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have said this. I wouldn't have done this. Now, here's another big attribute. They can move from being cold to hot emotionally in seconds. So they smile and they say good morning, and 10 seconds later, they can curse you out. Or they can turn off emotion and they can act like they never saw you before in their lives. And here's a final attribute. They will not tolerate any injustices that appear to be directed toward them. While on the other hand, they are relentless in their attacks toward the other spouse. This is what it spells out to be. They would never take off of you what you are expected to take off of them. They would not for 1 second accept an inappropriate word, a condescending remark from you toward them, the way they expect for you to just grin and bear it coming from them. Those are the attributes of abusers. Now, in the book of 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, Peter writes, "Now likewise you wives, be in an orderly manner to your own husbands." The King James says subjection. Be in an orderly manner to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation, or that word conversation can be better translated behaviors of the wives. You say, well, Dr. McClure, why do you mention 1 Peter 3:1? Because I want you to always know that females can also be abusers. Females can cross boundaries that they should not cross in terms of dealing with their spouses. That's why Peter will say, now you wives, you've got to be in an orderly manner. But look at 1 Peter 3, verse 7. Then he says, but likewise you husbands, if you're going to dwell, domicile, live in the same domain with them, do it according to knowledge. Now, that word knowledge is an interesting word. It means if you're going to handle them, and if they're going to handle you, kind of like the word we have for coitus, touch, to know, intercourse. He says, to the male, you must learn to give honor unto the wife. That's a high charge. You must learn as a male not to abuse your spouse. The best place for a man to learn not to abuse the spouse is outside the marriage before he gets married. The best place is actually in his home environment. The best place is actually in his church environment. But if his home was not a place to learn that, then it is the responsibility of that male to seek it out. If that church was not a place to learn that, it is still up to that male to seek out a place to learn, how do I dwell with my spouse according to knowledge? How do I learn to give honor to her as the weaker vessel? Now, weaker doesn't mean she's just so fragile, because it is in weak vessels, weaker vessels, that we carry precious gems. When you look at in the days of the first century church, wine was a precious commodity, but the vessel that the wine was in, the skins, was considered the lesser vessel. But what did you do with wine without the container? When you talk about olive oil in the first century church days, olive oil was a precious commodity. But where would you store the precious commodity of olive oil without the barrels, the lesser vessel? When you talk about clothing, the person in the clothing is seen as the precious vessel. But what happens if you don't have the garments, the lesser vessel, to put on the body? So this is what Peter is saying. God may have ordained the man to be the patriarch of the family, but you've got to always learn to honor and to esteem that helpmate. And they are to be heirs together of the grace of God in order for their prayers not to be hindered. There is no place in a marital relationship for abuse. No, not verbal abuse, not physical abuse, not humiliation, not financial abuse, not threatening harm. Let me visit with the threatening harm. Guys who do this in the present. What does that mean? Well, the implication is, instead of this being this, it could be you. You go hit a wall and you knock a hole in the wall. Well, what's that all about? Well, what it's really about is next time that could be you. Women may throw something and break it. Well, what's that all about? Well, I wish I would throw something and hurt you. Taking a knife and stabbing it into something. Well, what is that all about? Well, it could be you. See, all of that is intimidation, and those are threats. And there is no place, absolutely none, in a marital relationship for such behavior. I want you to think through matters that matter. And I just hope, trust, and pray that you will always be a person who understands, and that through your understanding, you might be able to bless someone else who might be struggling in his or her marriage relationship. I'm going to invite you to pray with me at this time. Father, it's only through your grace and your mercy that we're able to make it through the day. And because of this COVID-19 crisis, it has in many places forced husbands and wives into restricted spaces for a prolonged amount of times. And Father, sometimes the tension and the stressors might become overwhelming, but I just pray today that each spouse will take a step back, give themselves an opportunity to think through what is frustrating them. And Father, I pray that as they take that step back, that they will cry out to you. And we know, Father, that as anyone cries out to you, you're going to respond, and you're going to give a median of escape. And I just pray that if children are involved in such relationships, that you will protect them from the emotional and even the potential physical harm that might lurk in their way. We give you glory, we give you honor for just being our God and our keeper. Forgive us when we fall short, and yet, Father, we know that you're going to love us regardless. It's through Jesus I pray. Amen. Thank you for taking time to be with us today, and I just hope, trust, and pray that the lessons on matters that matter will not only strengthen your life, but it will strengthen you in such a way that you might be able to encourage others through whatever crises they might find themselves in. I look forward to seeing you back on tomorrow at noon for our midday devotional. We might grow weary, we might falter, stumble, and fall. In despair, we might feel forgotten, feeling that there's just no hope at all. But I know sometimes kindred may leave us, but death takes its toll throughout the years, and we know we will have sweet consolation, and my Jesus is gonna wipe away all tears. Hours of confusion we may have,
Jesus, and He will wipe away all tears. And sometimes friends won't receive you. They may with scorn scandalize your name. You might feel that your load is too heavy laden, and your loss far exceeds your gain. But friends, don't you worry, for judgment day's coming. I can't say when, but I'm told that it's near. And we know our reward awaits the faithful. And my Jesus is gonna wipe away all tears. We may have hours of confusion. We may have many doubts and many fears, but if we all just lean on King Jesus, and He will wipe away all our tears. We may have hours of confusion. We may have many doubts and many fears, but if we all just lean on Jesus, and He will wipe away all tears.